Welcome, everyone, to Cornell Keynotes. On today's show, we are joined by Vanessa Bohns, who is Bronstein Family Professor and the Department Chair of Organizational Behavior at Cornell's ILR School. I want to welcome you, Vanessa. Thanks for braving this wild snow squall here that happened in Ithaca this morning. Thanks for coming over to the studio.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, this should be a lot of fun. Professor Bohns, I should note, is author of the book, You Have More Influence Than You Think. So we've asked her to share her findings and tell us about her research on the topic that she does through the ILR School at Cornell. The takeaway from today's show for me and you, audience, you and I will be equipped to more closely examine our influence to understand it a little bit better with the goal of tapping our true power of persuasion for good. So, listeners, I should mention that Vanessa's publisher, Norton, has kindly offered us a 20% discount on the paperback edition of You Have More Influence Than You Think. So you'll see the URL dropped in the chat. Heads up for that. And there's, of course, some details on the promotional code. I think it's influence for that. So check out the book, go to the URL, and enjoy that 20% off if you're so inclined to buy it. We will take your questions throughout, as usual, right? So drop those in the chat, please, as well. And heads up, there's going to be an interactive segment shortly after we've gotten started and gotten some liftoff here. But get your phones ready. We're going to pop up a QR code just so you have those ready because we're going to need some input from you, which is critical to our conversation today. So Vanessa, let me ask you, you study social influence, compliance, and consent. I love this part. And why it's so hard to ask for things and why it's so hard to actually say no. So tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into this field of study, everything that led you to this point, up to like the publishing of the book and your work in influence and persuasion.
Sure. So I'm an experimental social psychologist. I got my PhD at Columbia and my BA in psychology at Brown before that. And I actually spent most of my life thinking I would go into advertising, and I kind of worked my way up to that. I got a job in one of those fancy Manhattan ad agencies, and I wound up doing all these things of persuasion, right? Actually trying to do the act of persuasion, trying to get people to sign up for things, trying to get people to buy things. And at some point in my first kind of year there, right out of college, I realized that I was really frustrated with that job.
Why?
So I felt like we were constantly kind of making guesses about what would appeal to people or persuade people. And we were kind of using, people were incredibly creative. They were incredibly smart, but they just had all these theories about what was most persuasive. And for me, I was like, well, I want to test those theories.
Yes.
Like, where's the data? How do we know what's actually going to work? And I saw kind of across the hall, there was the market research group.
Yeah.
They all had PhDs, and they all kind of were testing theories. And I was like, I want to be them. And so I wound up going back to graduate school eventually, but then falling in love with just academia and kind of doing the work of testing these things. And that's kind of what brought me here.
So how did you arrive at what is identified as kind of a unique perspective as it relates to influence? What's your thing?
Yeah. So as I said, initially I was kind of doing typical influence stuff, right? Trying to figure out like what is most persuasive. If we phrase something one way versus another, if we ask for something one way versus another, how can we be more influential? How can we get people to do these things? And I went to graduate school, and that was kind of the first question I had was, if we ask for something one way versus another, is it going to be more effective? And so I started working with a professor at Columbia, Frank Flynn, and we designed a study, and I barely remember the specifics of it now, but I very much remember the experience of running this study, because what I had to do was actually test out this prediction we had about how to ask for things. So we kind of came up with two expressions I could use to ask for things.
What were they?
I don't remember.
Oh, you don't remember
really don't remember.
But
yeah.
The gist is?
The gist is that we were kind of trying out these different, I think there were 2 or 3 different things I was supposed to go up to people and ask.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to make sure that we were testing this with a group of, ordinary adults instead of just college students. And so I was a first-year graduate student. And so I was the one in charge of going down to Penn Station to test out this theory, and going up to people in Penn Station, just random strangers, walking up to them and saying, will you fill out my questionnaire?
How'd that go?
I had some little expression, will you do it for this reason or that reason? But it was incredibly painful. It was like this very visceral, upsetting sort of experience. And so anyway, I had to do this up to, several hundred times to get 100 or so people to complete this survey. I finish the study. I bring all the data back to Columbia. We analyze it. And I vividly remember this is kind of where this whole approach to influence that we're going to be talking about today started is, we looked at the data and it didn't work. And this is actually a super normal thing to happen in science. Lots of studies we run don't work. But in this case, it was so devastating because it had been so painful to collect that data.
Sure.
And so I'm kind of just pacing around the room like, I can't believe this. I'm so distraught. This was the most horrible experience. I can't believe it didn't amount to anything. And so I'm describing this experience of going up to people as being awful. And the funny thing about that is that I had recorded the actual experience of going up to people and what they said and whether or not they agreed with what I asked. And so Frank was looking at the objective data on the spreadsheet and listening to me describe my experience. And he was like, I'm hearing you just describe this horrible experience full of rejection, and I'm looking at objective data that shows that people are saying yes to you and being actually quite kind to you in response. And so we were kind of like, wow, that's the big idea. Like nothing about these little ways of if I ask with like this extra word or whatever it was that we were testing, the big idea is really the way we think influence is in our heads and how effective we think we are at influence in our heads is so different from the reality. And so that kind of shaped all my work up to now. And I kind of learned that with this request context, but in the years since, I've seen that in so many other situations that I'm sure we'll get to in this conversation.
So writing about influence is nothing new, right? It's been around for a little bit. Yeah. How would you, elevator pitch, how would you distinguish your approach to influence and persuasion as it relates to any works that have come before or how we conventionally think about it?
Yeah, so it's very sort of typical to find books and seminars and, workshops on gaining influence. This is the classic Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People kind of approach. And that approach is fine, and people find it very helpful, but it really is about getting more influence, right? And my approach is kind of the opposite. It's like you don't actually need tips and tricks to get influence. This is really about recognizing the influence that you already have all the time that you just don't see. And so as a social psychologist, we're constantly seeing these studies where someone walks into a room and the whole vibe changes, or someone expresses their opinion and it changes someone's mind across the table. And those are the kinds of things that are happening all the time that we're not aware of when we're the ones doing it. And so we feel like, oh, I don't know how to influence someone, so I need to figure out like how to express this. When you just did, you just said your opinion and that influenced someone else's approach. So it's really more about recognizing your influence that you already have and less about trying to get this influence that you don't have.
You know what I think is going to be a little interesting detour. It's going to happen later in our conversation, but you talk about actually attenuating your influence, dialing it back in certain situations, which I think is fascinating. So let's go back to Carnegie, for instance, right? How do you distinguish between influence and power? This is critical.
Yeah, so understanding sort of what we're talking about when we talk about influence is sort of the first step. And so I think, we have to kind of think about these different ways we think about influence, and a lot of people conflate power and influence. Power is one way to have influence. It's kind of one subset of influence. So power is the kind of influence we have over someone where we can control their outcomes or we have some sort of positional authority over them. I use this example in my class. You can imagine that this weekend you're going to go to a movie. And if I'm your professor and I say, actually, we're going to incorporate the new Bob Dylan documentary into class next week, and I want everybody to watch it this weekend and write about it, and I'm going to grade a paper on it, right? I've just convinced you, I've made it more likely that you're going to go see that movie this weekend because I control your outcomes, because otherwise I can affect your grade, right? But you could also imagine a situation where you read this great review in the New Yorker, and you're like, oh, wow, they made that movie sound great, so I'm going to go see the new Bob Dylan documentary because that review sounded great. Now, that New Yorker reviewer doesn't have any power over you. They don't control your outcomes. They don't have any authority over you. Mm-hmm. And yet, because you respect them and they have this status, they also, just like I did as the professor, right, they've also influenced you to go see that movie. And so there's these different routes to influence, and power is just one. And when you think about it that way, you can kind of see that when you take routes such as like listening to someone you like, listening to someone you respect. You can go into that experience like, I actually am excited to see this movie as opposed to I'm compelled to see this movie, right? So it can be even more effective to influence someone through these other routes other than just when you have power.
Okay, so let's follow up on that. So when we talk about a situation like how might you, I don't want to use exert influence, but practice influence when you're talking about trying to influence somebody who's in a more of a powerful position than you. How do you think about that? How do you frame that? What do you do practically?
Yeah, so as we talked about, there's different ways to. And so one way is I actually can control your outcomes. We're assuming that is kind of off the table if you're trying to influence someone who has more power than you. So then there are these other ways. So there is something called informational influence. So that's essentially like, I know this information that you don't know, right? So maybe I don't control your outcomes, but I am like on the ground seeing all these things day to day. I have this information that will make your life better or will make your life easier, and kind of being that go-to person who has the information can make you very influential. It's a more status-driven kind of influence, right? They respect you. You have something that they need that is helpful. So you can kind of point out your expertise in a certain thing and have influence that way. Another way is just influence through liking. So we are influenced by people we like. And so this is where things like social networking come, right? So you imagine you're in a meeting, and if there's someone you've been spending time with and you like, and they're a friend and they speak up, you're more likely to actually listen to what they said and kind of take that whatever they said into advisement and kind of consider it than if it's someone that you don't know at all, right? So all those other things are ways to kind of gain influence without necessarily having power.
You had mentioned in our pre-game huddle a little bit about the influence as like an active endeavor or an inactive endeavor to some degree. And I want to ask you, like, what does that mean? Is it vibes? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, so I think, we tend to think of influence as this very formal thing. So I want you to do something. I'm going to actively try to get you to do that thing. And then your action is going to tell me whether I influenced you, right? But influence actually happens all the time without this kind of active, formal way of trying to get someone to do something. So simply by, engaging in a behavior that other people see, we impact that person. They start to recognize that, oh, wait, maybe that's a norm, and people follow norms. When we go into a situation and we don't know what's expected, we look to other people to figure out what the norms are. And that means that when we're behaving in a situation, other people are looking to us to understand what the norms are. So we're not actually trying to influence anybody, we're just kind of influencing them by being ourselves. You can also think of like a throwaway remark. Who doesn't have someone's throwaway remark kind of just burned in their brain, reverberating? You always think about this thing someone said, and you ask them and you say like, I remember when you said this thing, and they're like, I don't remember ever saying that, right? So these throwaway remarks that we make can also sometimes impact other people in ways that we just completely don't anticipate. And so that whole sort of range of things also, in my definition, counts as influence.
I want to talk about the tagline for your book, which is how we underestimate our powers of persuasion and why it matters. So let me ask you, how do we do it and why does it matter?
Yeah, so, we do it in all of these ways that I've been talking about. So those moments where we behave in a certain way and someone else mimics that behavior because they're using our behavior to sort of understand the norm of a situation, we tend to underestimate how much other people are actually paying attention to our behavior. So we underestimate how much people see us, copy us.
And your research supports this.
There is research to support that. That's
Okay,
right.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, so there's research on something called the invisibility cloak illusion.
Yeah.
This is by Erica Boothby. And she basically shows that when we're sort of going about our daily life and just, sitting on the subway or, walking across campus or whatever we might be doing, that more people notice us than we assume. And so she's done these studies where she has people just sit in a room with another person and ask them, how much do you think other people notice like what you are wearing? And afterwards, she looks and sees how much other people did notice what you were wearing, and you tend to underestimate how much the other person was paying attention to you.
Yeah.
Interestingly, this is not true if you're wearing something you're really embarrassed about. So this is just like I'm wearing my ordinary clothes. I'm not thinking much about it, but people are kind of looking at me and I'm not noticing. And this happens because we all kind of look away when we catch someone's eye. We're like, we don't want them to know we're staring at them.
Right.
So, but if we are acutely embarrassed, so she has other studies where she gives someone a T-shirt and it's an embarrassing T-shirt, and then she asks them how many people were paying attention to what you were wearing, and then looks at how many people were actually paying attention. And there you get this acute sort of spotlight effect. Right, so you get this invisibility cloak illusion where I'm just going about my ordinary day and assuming no one's noticing me, but lots of people actually are. Or you're like, I'm having a really bad hair day. Or I'm just like feeling really self-conscious about what I'm wearing today. And then you're like, everyone's noticing that, but in fact, most people are not. So it's a happy story kind of both ways. But it does, the sort of influence element is that because of that, we might be wearing something, to give sort of a very sort of superficial example, right? We could be wearing something from 5 years ago. We didn't pay any attention. We threw it on. And other people noticed it, and they're like, oh, that was really cute. And now they go and sort of buy that thing. And we don't realize we actually impacted their behavior down the line.
Yeah, it's funny how a lot of this, and maybe I'll ask you about your early training, but a lot of this is social regulatory kind of behavioral stuff, right? This is just kind of how we behave. And I think I might have cut you off when you were just getting liftoff on why it actually matters. But why is being persuasive important? I think I understand, but...
So what it really means is that if people are paying more attention to us than we realize, it means that our behaviors really are impacting those social norms in ways we don't realize. The things we say do matter to people and affect them in ways that we might not realize. And so we kind of, I like to avoid as much as possible the Spider-Man quote of, with great power comes great responsibility. But a major sort of ramification of this idea that we underestimate our influence is that, if we have more influence than we think, we also have more responsibility to kind of pay attention to the things that we say and pay attention to how they might impact other people as well.
And I think that's a really interesting takeaway from the book, right? Which is just the fact that we do, and your research supports it, underestimate our own power of influence.
Yeah.
That's got to be a surprise, I think, for a number of people in our audience. Speaking of which, so if you have questions, drop them in the chat. I'll be taking those on the iPad here. You also have research on the underappreciated importance of expressing appreciation and gratitude, whether it's personally in the workplace, whatever. What were your findings there? I was surprised at the outcome.
Yeah, so this is an example of the way in which things that we say to other people can impact them more than we realize. And in this case, it was looking at how expressing gratitude for other people or just expressing a simple compliment can make people feel better than we expect it to.
You would think so.
Yeah, so we ran some studies, some with strangers, and then some other researchers ran studies with people, friends and people you know. And in our studies, we basically brought people into the lab and instructed them to give random people compliments. So we said, okay, you're going to go and find, the fifth person you run into, because we didn't want them targeting a certain person, just random people, right? You're going to say, hey, I like your shirt. That's all you're going to say. And we asked people before they went and did this, how good do you think that's going to make the other person feel? And we asked them, how awkward is that interaction going to be? And so then they went out, they did this, and then we gave a survey to the person who was complimented. And we asked them, how good do you feel? Like, how flattered do you feel? And then how awkward was that whole thing?
Yeah.
And what we found is that our participants didn't realize, they underestimated how good that compliment would make the person feel, and they overestimated how awkward the exchange would be. And this has been replicated using, friends, using gratitude letters, like writing a letter that really expresses gratitude to like a mentor in your past. And the big sort of unifying explanation is that we get so focused on how to express it just right, like how to say what we really mean to say, and how we might stumble over our words or be awkward, and this kind of competence piece that like I'm not going to be able to express myself accurately and they're going to judge me for that. And we forget that when someone says something nice about you, it just feels good. Like we forget that it's just really about the emotion and the warmth, and no one cares if you stumbled or said it awkwardly. It's just like, oh, that felt really good.
It can really make your day,
Yeah.
right? Just a simple compliment. I think a lot of people probably also have fears of misfiring on that compliment,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely,
You know what I mean?
yeah.
Taking the wrong way, et cetera.
Yeah.
I have a really good question from Andrea here, who asks, or opens up with the bridging influencing style. Bridging influencing style, you familiar with this?
No.
Anyway, she explains, involves a degree of vulnerability, which can sometimes be perceived as a weakness or make others uncomfortable in a professional setting. How can I effectively use the bridging style without appearing weak or burdening others? So any vulnerability component within some of your studies where maybe a leadership style is perceived as maybe a little bit more weak or stronger than others? I don't know.
Yeah, so I think I'm not sure exactly what the bridging influence style is,
Yep.
but I can say, thinking about sort of leadership, that it relates also to the discussion about power, right? We tend to kind of assume that to be a good leader, that you really want to sort of impose and manage and kind of be much more active than you really need to be. Whereas so much of leadership that we're not taught is kind of taking a step back and making room for other people. We tend to feel this need to like prove ourselves. And so one example I give in the book is when I worked at the sleep lab as an undergraduate. And this was a crazy sleep lab where these kids would come for an entire week and be like in a dark basement with electrodes on their heads and doing very uncomfortable things. And in the book, I talk about how we found really important results. It wasn't actually that terrible for the kids. But going into it, you're kind of like, oh my God, how am I going to maintain control of these? They were like, kids like around pubescent years. You imagine them just kind of rebelling against the situation. And the very first day of our training, we had this clinical psychologist who was in charge of the well-being of the kids. And they said, these kids are going to do anything you ask. They are going to be nervous. You are in a power position. They're not going to want to tell you if something's uncomfortable, if they don't like what you're doing. So you have this responsibility to pay attention, right, and not kind of overreach in terms of your power and influence, right, to actually listen more. And I never forgot this idea of like, the way we go into as leaders, we're like, okay, how am I going to make people listen to me? How am I going to control? It's just our natural sort of instinct, right? And especially if we've risen from the ranks and we like want to prove ourselves, when in fact so much of it is like now you're in a power position and you have to like kind of take a step back and realize what that means and how that's changed the dynamics and kind of what responsibility you have now to that group.
Yeah, I think so. Great question, Andrea, and thanks for taking us where you took us on that one. I think it was really useful. Audience, now's the time. We do need your input, so get your phones ready. We're going to be displaying a QR code here. We're going to keep this up for a minute because it's going to take a second to populate, but real simply, question number one, what is your comfort level when making requests? We all have to do it. Here are the three choices. I limited it to this. I'm usually uncomfortable because I fear I may come across as unreasonable or imposing. Don't want to put this person out. Question or response number two, I'm somewhat comfortable making requests, but I do so sparingly. Number three, I'm a request pro, no issues whatsoever. I will ask for anything. So let's let that go for a minute. In the meantime, Vanessa, what are some of your research findings around making requests? What have you observed?
Yeah, so really, from that experience that I had in Penn Station, which is where I learned kind of how making requests was in my head compared to the reality. Frank Flynn, the person I was working with at the time, and I decided to see if we could actually use that as an experimental paradigm and see how other people would respond and behave in a very similar situation. And so at this point, we've run more than about 12,000 people in our study. So we've been doing this for like 15 years now. And we have brought people into the lab and basically made them do what I had to do in Penn Station. So we've said, we're going to send you out into the world and we're going to have you ask for things. And so we've had them go up to strangers and ask, to complete surveys, just like I did in Penn Station, to loan their cell phones to our participants, even to do kind of crazy things, which we can get to, like vandalize a library book. And also people who have been who are already in a position of needing to ask for things. So we've teamed up with Team in Training, this charitable organization where people actually had to ask for sponsors, and we had people go ahead and make those asks. Now, in all these cases, we said to people before they made these requests, how likely do you think it is that people are going to agree? So we said, basically, how many people are you going to have to ask before you reach your goal or get 5 people to agree or whatever it might be? And so we would ask them, have them go out and actually make these requests, and then compare what people predicted to what actually happened. And we found, again, with almost 12,000 people, that people underestimated how likely people were to agree to their requests.
So maybe that sort of fits in with what we have found here. So most of our audience, 63%, said kind of comfortable making requests, but I do so sparingly. And maybe that speaks to the idea of the unlikelihood, thinking that the likelihood of someone saying yes is probably not very good.
Yeah, I think it's partly, right, this idea of, people don't ask for things for lots of reasons, right? They don't ask because they're worried about a no, but it could also be that, we're worried that we don't want to impose on somebody. We worry that people don't actually want to do the thing that we're asking. And so this is a very fine line that I tread in my research, because there's research showing that we actually enjoy helping other people. It makes us happy. We appreciate being asked if in the end that can actually make us feel like a good, helpful person, right? On the other hand, we find it very hard to say no. And so when you're on this kind of receiving end of a request, you do worry, about, it is a legitimate worry to kind of worry about coercing people into doing something.
I should note that 19% of our audience are request pros.
Yeah, I think that's
no issues whatsoever. So maybe they understand the likelihood to say yes.
Yeah. And that's pretty typical too. I always get a couple people when I give talks, for example, who are like, I have no problem with this, I ask. And so there's definitely this individual variability for sure.
Oh, that's so funny to see. Okay, let's look at, we're going to go question number 2 here. Let's roll right into the second one. How well do you respond to requests, listeners? Option number 1, they're a constant irritation. I think people should handle their own business. Number 2, I'm careful about which requests I fulfill. It depends on the ask and the person doing the asking. Number 3, or the third, I'm always happy to oblige when others make requests of me. Makes me feel essential. Bring them on. So let's let that populate for a minute. Thanks for your participation, by the way, audience. So Vanessa, why is it hard to say no? What have you found?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So, we are often acutely sort of aware of how hard it is to be rejected, right? We all know it hurts to be rejected.
Oh, yeah.
But we forget sometimes, especially when we're the ones asking for something, that it also hurts to be the one who has to do the rejecting, right? We are evolutionarily wired to maintain social ties, to smooth things over with the group. And there's no kind of worse way to disrupt these social ties than to reject someone, right? And so we worry about this. When we're going to say no, it's not that we're saying no and, there's this expression, no is a complete sentence, which just drives me crazy, because I think it's very rare for people to actually feel like they can use no as a complete sentence, right? Instead, we're worried, if I say no, this is going to mean something about me, like I'm not a helpful person. Or if I say no, it's going to mean something about our relationship, like, we don't have the kind of relationship where I would do that for you. Or it might mean something about that person, like they don't deserve this or they shouldn't be asking for this. And so all these things are going through our heads. And when we say no, we kind of want to address all those things, which makes it really hard to find the words to say no.
Right.
Right? And so you're kind of in this loop of trying to find the words to say no. And so it does come from this very positive place where we want to be helpful people. We want to be close to people, but it can make it very hard to say no.
Exactly. Or to come off like we're trying to come up with some viable excuse that may not actually be the reality. Let's look at our results here. Okay, yeah, kind of what I predicted, right? Careful about which requests I fulfill. It depends on the ask and the person doing the asking. 35% of us said always happy to oblige.
Yeah.
Maybe no surprises there, but it speaks to some of the dynamics that you had just kind of reviewed there a moment ago. Very cool. Thanks, audience, for your participation. Thanks for these questions that are coming in, by the way. We'll hit these in a couple minutes. So if it's harder than we realize for people to say no to us, how do we create, as the requestors, a place where people do actually indeed feel safe to say no?
Yeah, I think this is really important and something we don't talk about enough. So there tend to be a lot of resources to help people get better at saying no. And we really sort of put the onus on the person who's on the receiving end of the request, right? And so, we'll tell people to have a script and we'll tell people, to plan ahead and do all these things. But I also think that, again, coming from this context of this idea that we have more influence than we think, when we ask someone for something that impacts them more than we realize, we should also find ways to ask for things where we kind of give people the space to say no. And so some of the things we've looked at are, actually, we talked about how hard it is to find the words, and we've done studies where we actually give people the words to say no when you make a request. So, we've all done the thing where it's like, will you do this? You can totally say no. So we're telling people they can say no.
And here's how or why or
right. So the thing about telling people they can say no, right, is that they already know that. Like, I could say no. I'm just having trouble finding the words.
Yes.
So we have sort of a condition where we tell them they can say no, and then another condition where we say, if you'd like to say no, just say the words, and it changes depending on the study. I'd rather not, or give me this excuse. Like, just say you don't have time. And it's basically saying, like, I will accept that excuse. That will alleviate all those concerns you had about what this no might mean. I'm giving you a safe word, essentially, to say no to me. And we find that people feel more comfortable and freer to say no if you give them the words. Other things that I do in particular a lot are ask for them to respond through email or text, which is often much easier than saying no to someone's face, and giving people time to process. So I have graduate students. I often want to ask them to do something, but I really, really only want them to say yes if they have the time and really want to do that thing. And so what I'll do is I'll make my pitch in person, and I'll say, here's this. I think this is a really good idea. It would be really helpful. But don't tell me right now. I want you to think about it, and then just email me in a couple days. So I'm giving them time. They can come up with the words to say no. And I even sometimes tell them, just tell me you don't have time. And then I've also given them the words to say no. So it's this way of like, you make your best pitch, but then you put it in their court and you don't pressure them.
Yeah, I have to do a lot of pitching, and qualifying the ask is something they always can never really kind of forget. Any thoughts on that, like how to better position the request itself?
Yeah. So, I think there's so much.
Already did, but yeah.
Yeah. There's so much in like sort of how to ask to get a yes. And so all those kinds of things are like, ask in person.
Right.
Get that answer right there. Be direct. I'll say one of the things that people often forget that makes a huge difference is to be direct. I can't tell you how often people say, it would be great if you would do this. And they didn't actually ask me. Everyone knows that's the ask, but it's a lot easier to say, well, yeah, than if they say, will you do this, right? Just simply turning it into an actual request now is something that they actually would have to say no to say no, right? They can't just kind of dodge it. And so actually asking is actually a huge mistake people make when they ask.
Negotiation among genders and sexes, very dynamic. Interesting place, and I'm going there because Kathleen chimes in and asks, you had mentioned likability as a factor in influencing others. How do we increase our own likability? Big question. I also worry that this advice seems much like advice given to women for ages or women who are moving on in age, whereas men don't need to be as likable to have influence. There's that. Then Randy checks in. My experience is that this is very different for men than women and possibly can also change with age. Any thoughts on these? What are your findings?
Yeah, this is a huge question, of course. I will say for this idea about, the idea of how gender and likability kind of clash, there's a great book called Likeable Badass by Alison Fregali, and she addresses this exact thing, kind of the ways in which the actual realistic kinds of issues that women face about needing to be likable, to be able, if you're going to exert your power, you also have to be likable in ways that men can just exert their power, right? And she kind of talks about how you can balance all those things. But I'll say in terms of gender and other demographics, age, race, all these things. I like to think of it in terms of 3 buckets when it relates to influence. So the first bucket is the actual influence you have. And we know from, just decades of research that there are actual differences in the influence you have based on your demographic. So, there's actual research that show, it used to be women don't ask. That's not true anymore. New research shows that women actually do ask, but they don't get what they ask for as much. So there's an actual real difference in, gender, same thing for race, right? Then if we move over to this second bucket, which is what I study, which is, what are your intuitions about what would happen if you did ask? Do you underestimate how likely it would be that you would get a yes? Do you overestimate, etc.? And what we find in a lot of different contexts is that there aren't these demographic differences. So while there are real differences, we're all sort of underestimating where we are in the spectrum. We're all kind of underestimating the influence that we have. And then there's this third bucket. It's like, so what does that mean for you depending on these demographic factors? And to take gender as one example, right? So if women and men both underestimate their influence, right? Women, right, might take that information and say, well, if I'm not likely to get a yes, then I'm not even going to bother asking. Whereas men may say, I don't think I'm going to get a yes, but I'm just going to go for it because of the different ways we've been socialized to kind of take risks versus to, maintain these social connections and smooth things over. So it really is complicated, right? There are actual differences in influence. We all seem to underestimate. And at the same time, the fact that we all underestimate can still mean different things, which lead to different behaviors down the road. So yeah, demographic, kind of the way we're socialized depending on our demographics can make a huge difference.
But that's the critical message, right? We're all underestimating our potential for influence, which is where the power really is. And that's, I think, where I hope that our audience goes after this, right? Thinking about it. So in your book, You Have More Influence Than You Think, you offer some tips and exercises for getting more in touch with recognizing the influence that we have. So tools, what do we do?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different exercises. Some get you better at seeing the influence you have. So we'll start just with that. So this is the idea that when we're in a situation, just by virtue of, our biology, we are seeing outward, we're seeing everybody else and how they're impacting us. And we're just not seeing what we're doing that might be impacting the situation. And so one thing that research has found to be really effective is doing this little exercise where you essentially reflect on maybe a difficult conversation that you had with somebody, and you reflect on it from a third-party perspective. So you imagine you're a fly on the wall. Another way that's been used is you imagine that you're a either neutral observer or just a colleague or a friend who really likes both people involved, and you write about it from that perspective. And this now puts you in the frame, right? Now you're seeing yourself and the other person, not just all those things that were coming at you from the other person, but also all the things you were doing that person was responding to. And so that can give us some more insight in sort of the way that we contribute to a situation. And there's some really fascinating research by Eli Finkel, who's done this in the context of newlyweds. And for the first year of people's marriages, he assigned one group of participants to essentially do this, and they and their spouse were both going to do this. They recalled a fight that they had with their spouse from this third-party perspective just 3 times over the course of the year for like this 20-minute exercise. And when they looked at marital satisfaction, they found that it actually remained stable, whereas sorry to say, like people who didn't do it, it just went down that first year of marriage. And so it does seem to kind of give us a little sense of maybe the dynamics that we are also contributing to. So that's one way.
Yeah, I mean, being reflective is a great attribute, but how to do it, maybe not so much for a lot of us, right? This is kind of a high-level emotional intelligence that you must cover in the book to some degree. I have a couple more questions here. From our audience, who I've got to ask it because this is coming up. People are thinking about the job title of influencer versus exerting influence. How do you talk about this when you're making the rounds on this? People must ask you for influencer advice, but this seems outside of your purview or what we're talking about.
You know what's interesting is, so one thing I talk about is usually when people are thinking of influencers at this point, it's almost always social media influencers.
Yep.
And so it is really interesting because these social media influencers have totally skewed our idea of the influence we have on social media. So if you ask people sort of these questions that get at how much influence they have when they post something on social media, they also underestimate it there. So we talked about the invisibility cloak illusion, and this is kind of underestimating how much people are noticing what we do and where in our daily life. But we also do there's also something called the invisible audience online. So we post something and we assume that, based on likes or actual engagement, like comments, we can kind of figure out how many people saw that thing. In fact, a huge number of people see those posts that don't comment on it and then maybe mention it to someone down the line, or it affects something that they post down the line. And so, in fact, the things that we post on social media have much more effect than we assume. So we underestimate our influence there as well. And part of the reason we do that is that we are so focused on influencers as these people who have just this insane number of followers, and you look at their engagement and it's just so high that we don't realize that actually in many cases, we may be very well an above average influencer on social media, but our comparison group is just so, off the charts, essentially.
Yeah, thank you for making that distinction. So I have a question here. I want to get into some terminology that you cover in your book about getting better at feeling or sensing our influence over the others. Again, getting back to our central theme here, what's the difference between taking perspective and getting perspective? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so this, again, we can kind of start to acknowledge like, oh, I did these things and that person might have responded to them. But it's still really hard to get in someone's head and really know how things that we said or did made that person actually feel. And so one thing that people will often instruct people to do, and Dale Carnegie even does that in How to Win Friends and Influence People, again, great book, not trying to like throw him under the bus or anything, but he instructs people to try to take the other person's perspective. But social psychologists know that we are notoriously terrible perspective takers. So when we try to take someone else's perspective, we inherently anchor on our own perspective and how we would behave, and not just how we would behave or feel, but how we think we would behave or feel, which often is not even true to how we would behave or feel.
Right.
Not to mention, how we hope the other person is taking something we said. So, if I'm trying to figure out like how you felt about some comment I made, I'm like, well, I wouldn't have been hurt by that. And I kind of, all these kind of self-serving biases kick in to make me think like, you can't really be that upset by that, for example. So when we try to take perspective, we make a lot of mistakes and we don't learn much about our actual impact. Some researchers recently came up with the simplest possible way to actually understand how someone else is feeling or impacted by things that we say, and they call it getting perspective, and it's literally just asking people. So ask them, how did that make you feel? And listening. So we so often are trying to guess, and we don't just go ahead and ask.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing they found is that when they ask people, is it going to be, if you just try to guess or you ask them, is going to make a big difference in basically your interpretation. And people are like, no, I could guess just as well as, if they actually told me. But in fact, it was a huge difference, right? When they actually asked people how they felt about something or what they knew about something, they were, not surprisingly, so much more accurate about how they actually felt.
There you go, another path to influence. Speaking of which, we have the promotional code for Vanessa's book. It's Influence for 20% off the paperback edition. We're going to drop that back in the chat. And let me back up here real quick. Speaking of homework, next steps, to-dos, any advice for our audience? What are just the one or two things that you want our audience to take with them as they leave our keynote here today?
Yeah, I think, there's a few things that I like to suggest that kind of wraps it all up. So when we ask for things, we want to give ourselves the best chance, right? And so I like to tell people to actually ask, make a direct request, right? Ask in person. And when you do ask, assume that you're going to get a yes. And if you assume that, when I ask, this person is going to say yes, which is more likely than we tend to think, that sets the right tone. So you're not, negotiating with yourself before you negotiate with the other person. You're not kind of going in guns blazing and like way too aggressive trying to get past that no that you're anticipating. And at the same time, you're not, avoiding asking or holding back. So ask in person, ask directly, assume a yes, it'll set the tone. But also by assuming a yes, that also makes you kind of aware of the ways in which that you could ask for something that maybe would put someone on the spot or pressure somebody, right? So it's not just about getting to that yes, but I always like to point out it's also about trying not to pressure people because it is actually hard for people to say no.
Author of You Have More Influence Than You Think, Vanessa Bohns. It's been lovely to have you in the studio today.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you, audience, for your poll responses and your interactivity and cool questions coming in as well. So I want to thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time on Keynotes. Have a good day, everyone. See you next time.